All right, let me show you how to create an API middleware. So here in the middleware folder, let's add a new file called api.js. Here we define a constant called API and set it to store, goes to next, goes to action, goes to this block of code. Now, here we're going to export this as a default object. Now, before we forget, let's register this when configuring our store. So we go to configure store.js. On the top, we import our new middleware from middleware/API, and then add it in the array of middleware functions. Pretty simple. We're done with this file. Now, over here, in this middleware, we want to handle specific types of actions that indicate an API call. Let me show you. So I'm going to define an action. This is purely for demonstration. We're not going to use this. The type of this action can be something like API call began. You could call this anything. You could call this API request. It's entirely up to you. Now, in the payload of this action, we're going to have all the data we need to make an API call. So we're going to have the URL. This can be something like /bugs. We're going to have method. I forgot a comma here. Let's add that. We're going to have the method, which can be get, post, put, and so on. If you want to post any data to the server, we add it over here. We can also have a property called onSuccess. And this is the name of the action that should be dispatched if this operation is successful. For example, bugs received. We can also have onError, which we can set to bugs request failed, or we can set this to something more general like API request failed. Now, what is important here is that here we're using strings. We're not passing functions as callbacks because this action object should be serializable. We should be able to store it. Functions are not serializable. So that is the reason I'm using strings here. Okay. Now, our API middleware should be able to handle this kind of action. So here we check the type of the action. If action, the type, does not equal API call began, then we're going to pass this action to the next middleware. So we call next and pass the action and then return because we don't want the rest of this function to be executed. Now we can simplify this code by putting the return statement here. And now because we have a single statement in this block, we can get rid of the braces and our code is simpler and cleaner. So if we get here, that means we're dealing with an action for calling an API endpoint. Now here we have to follow 3 steps. First, we have to make the API call, and then we need to handle the resolve and reject cases. For making API calls, I'm going to use Axios. You can use any libraries that you prefer. So let's install Axios. All right, I'm using version 0.19. Now on the top, we're going to import Axios. So import Axios from Axios. Now, we're going to extract these properties from the payload of our action using object destructure syntax. So that is pretty easy. We define a bunch of constants, URL, method, data, onSuccess, and onError. We're going to pick these properties from action.payload. Next, we're going to use Axios to make an API call. So Axios.request, we pass an object, and in this object, we add a bunch of properties, URL, method, and data. Now this URL, as I told you before, is the URL of our endpoint, like /bugs. It's not the full URL. So here we need to add another property called base URL. Note that the URL is capital. So we set this to HTTP localhost port 9001/API. Now in a real application, we probably want to store this somewhere in a configuration file for the application. In this demo, I'm just going to keep it here for simplicity. Now we have all the pieces. So the request method returns a promise. Here we can call then and then catch to handle this promise, or we can use async and await, which is my preference. So let's remove these 2 methods. We're going to await this promise to get the response. Okay. Now, when using the await keyword, we have to wrap this line inside a try block. So try. Now let's move these few lines over here. Next, we add a catch block. So here we get an error. Now this is the point where we need to dispatch two different types of actions. If everything works successfully, we're going to dispatch the success action. So if we type dispatch, look, it's not available here because we need to pick it from this store object. So here I'm going to use object destructuring to pick the dispatch function. Now, if everything works well, we're going to dispatch an action with this type. What is the type of this action? That is what we have in this constant. So we set that to unsuccess. And in the payload of this action, we're going to add the result of our API call. We can get that from response.data. So this is the success scenario. Now, if something goes wrong, we're going to dispatch a different kind of action. So here we're going to dispatch an action with this type on error. And in the payload, we're going to put the error message, the error object. Okay. So this is the basic structure. Now, because we're using await here, we need to mark the last function here as async. Now let's test this implementation. So we go to index.js, and after we create our store, we're going to dispatch an action. I'm going to get this action from this module. This is what we wrote earlier, so we're not going to use this in our middleware. Let's cut this code and paste it in index.js. So we're going to dispatch an action with this type, API call began. And in the payload, we have these properties. Now, in this case, we don't need to specify the method because by default, get is used. So let's simplify this code. Also, we need to add any data in the body of the request. So let's remove this as well. Now, we got to get rid of the semicolon and we're ready to test this. So save the changes. Here in the console, we don't have any errors. Beautiful. Now let's look at the Redux tab. We only have a single action, bugs received. So what happened to this action? API call began. It's not appearing here. Let me explain why. In our middleware, if the type of this action is not API call began, we pass it to the next middleware function. Otherwise, we handle this action by making an API call and then dispatching a different kind of action. So essentially what is happening here is that we're swallowing the original action. If you want that action to appear in Redux DevTools, you have to pass it to the next middleware function before making an API call. So over here, actually before we extract these properties, I'm going to call next action. Now, save the changes. Take a look. So API call began. Look at the payload of this action. It has everything that we need for making this API call. Beautiful. In this case, our call is successful, so we received the second action. Now let's simulate the failure scenario. So in our middleware, I'm going to change the port to 9002. Save the changes. Now we have API call began and API request failed. Now the naming convention here is not very clean and consistent. We're going to solve that in the next video.